Church of the Highlands, I am so excited this morning to bring to you President and founder of the ministry named Makeway Partners. This is Kimberly Smith from her home outside of Birmingham, Alabama. Kimberly, can you hear me?
I do. Welcome to the Highlands. It's great to be with you this morning.
Awesome. We got a great connection here. Just a few months ago, Kimberly, you had to be medevaced out of the Sudan. You had malaria, pneumonia, a 105 fever, and how are you doing?
I'm doing just great. Total recovery, and I'm back in the saddle. Thanks, though, and I appreciate your prayers. I'm sure that's a lot of why I got through that time.
Praise God. We were indeed praying for you. And Kimberly, I would like the church to just have an opportunity to hear a bit of testimony from you. And in doing that, I just would like for you to describe Kimberly Smith before you founded Makeway Partners in 2003 and Kimberly Smith after.
Well, I was probably a lot like many of you. I was active in my church. I had been a Christian since I was 11 years old, but was busy climbing the corporate ladder. I was an executive in corporate America. I was busy raising my children, living in the right community, having all of the things that I thought came along with being a Christian. I won't say that I had bought into the prosperity gospel, but I will say that I had somewhere in my thinking developed the mindset, because I had always been, as an adult, comfortable and a Christian, and I looked at other Christians in my churches that I had been in that were also comfortable and Christian. I had sort of begun to think that the two came together. And it wasn't until I went to the mission field and was exposed to a different kind of lifestyle that God really began to separate those two for me.
Thanks for sharing that. And when we go to Makeway Partners website, we learned that the ministry is committed to going where women and children are at highest risk of human trafficking, forced prostitutions, and other forms of modern-day slavery, and where little or no help is available because it's considered either too dangerous, too expensive, or too remote for most people to go. Currently, Makeway Partners' major focus is in the Sudan and Romania and, praise God, most recently Congo. What makes these areas particularly vulnerable to the atrocity of human trafficking?
Well, when we first discovered human trafficking, my husband and I were missionaries with a couple of our children in the Iberian Peninsula. And it was there that we first found 19 African immigrant children being forced into a brothel. In that brothel, once we had those children liberated, which it took us 2 years of fighting the government, once we were able to liberate those children, we began studying how they got to that situation to begin with. What were children as young as 6 years old being, boys and girls, how did they end up being forced into prostitution? And what we learned was that while human trafficking is on every continent in this world today, especially sexual slavery, what drives it is different on every continent. A common denominator, though, is that orphans and widows are the most vulnerable. Of course, as Christians, that really speaks to us because in the Bible, again and again, we're told to care for the orphans and widows. So we go to places where orphans and widows are at a high volume with no infrastructure to protect them. Although, of course, we have suffering here in our own country, we have great infrastructures that really fight against oppression. Sometimes people do fall through the cracks. But in places like war zones or lawless land where the government is corrupt and complicit in the problem, there is absolutely no one there to protect these women and children. On top of that, they're often really remote locations where you can't just get on a plane and fly to inexpensively. It's very difficult to get there. So on top of the corruption or the war, the fact that they're isolated and expensive to get to, most of us tend to want to just go to someplace that's more accessible. We don't have to spend as much money to go, or it's less expensive to take care of a child. That meant that these women and children were being dropped through the gaps, and that just broke my heart when I learned about that extreme suffering. I had seen suffering before, but when I found that extreme suffering where no other options were available, God just really convicted me that that's what my life was about.
Well, no doubt that in your work with orphans in the Sudan, you've come to know and love countless children whose stories of survival, I can imagine, have radically changed you and captured your heart. Can you share with us about one or two of the children that particularly stand out in your mind?
I would love to. There are so many faces that come flooding to my mind when you ask that question. I wish I had pictures that I could show you. We could do a slideshow or something, but I'll tell you two short stories or long stories, but an encapsulated version of them that really speak to not only what happens when Christians don't respond in time, but also show the power of God when we do allow Him to use us in time. The first story is of a little girl named Teresa, and I met Teresa on my first trip into Darfur, Sudan 6 years ago, when I'd spent several days up in a camp. We'd started out with 31 tons of food, medicine, other kinds of life-saving supplies, but we were out of supplies by this time because there were thousands of people there. Once we were out of supplies, we were getting ready to leave, and I hoped to come back to the States where we would raise more funds, buy more supplies. The women brought a little girl to me. I was on a team of 25 people, but I was the only female on that team, and I think they brought her to me thinking that since we were out of supplies and they had gotten the answer no several times, that we couldn't help her because we were out of supplies, and they didn't understand. They so desperately wanted help for Teresa. So they brought her to me, I think, thinking that as a woman I would try a little bit harder, but there was nothing I could do. We had no more supplies. And in Darfur, there aren't Walmarts or pharmacies or even grocery stores. There's absolutely nothing but desert. So we didn't have anything, and I knelt down beside Teresa, and it was obvious she had some kind of severe eye infection. She was sick, she was dehydrated. I pinched at her skin, and there was no pucker left in it, and so I knew she was severely dehydrated. She was running a fever, and I knew something else was wrong, but I'm not a doctor, and I didn't know how to diagnose. So I just knelt down and looked at her, and I said, Teresa, I'm sorry, I don't have anything else to help you, but I promise I will go back to my country where I know people will be praying for you, they will be praying for your people, and I will tell your story. We will raise support, we will come back, and we will help you and your people. I did that. It took a lot longer to raise the support and to get back than I had hoped that it would. And when I finally did get back, and I went looking through that same camp for Teresa, I couldn't find her. After a few days, I did finally find some of the women that had brought her to me. And in that short period of time, that seemed like a long time, but really had only been a few months, Teresa had died. And the only thing that they could tell me was that she was thirsty when she died. Teresa had been the product of sexual slavery because as a Christian Sudanese, her mother had been raped by the Janjaweed, or the Muslim Islamic regimes. And that's how Teresa had come into the world. Her mother had already died, and we don't know how. Most of them, when we lose them, we don't know how. And then Teresa followed the same fate, and it just broke my heart. But at the same time, God also used that to really inspire me that our response to what breaks His heart makes the difference between life and death in the lives of many others. So I continued the work, and in that work I met a little boy named Peter Dang. And Peter Dang is about 10 years old when we first got him. And he's now in our orphanage. And Peter one day was sitting and just crying, was very sad. And I asked him what was wrong. And he told me his life story. And I'm sorry, I didn't ask you ahead of time. I don't know if you have young children in your audience, and so I'll probably, can you tell me that? Are there young children?
Yes, there are some.
Okay, then I'll just say that his life had been a very difficult life. He'd been an orphan from a very young age and had watched his parents be killed. But Peter was really sad and was recounting some of that story to me that day. And so as I talked with him, I said, Peter, you've raised yourself basically alone in the desert. You're here now in our orphanage, but how did you come to know Jesus before this? You came in as a believer. How did you come to know Jesus? He told me that one day he was alone in the desert and he was crying out to God, how, if you're real, he had heard about God, but he didn't know the gospel. He didn't know Jesus. He didn't know the story. He said, if you're real, then how do you